Hello, dear viewers. Support me by subscribing to my channel and share my video if you like it. And also, make sure you comment your thought. Now let's start the video. King's Landing 207 AC. Marjorie. She had almost had to be held in her seat to stop her from going to him. Only her grandmother's words, and Sansa's hand keeping her from doing so. As she had looked down and seen Joy with him, she had felt it should have been her to offer him that comfort, though she was glad someone did. Sitting through the archery was a chore after that, and she was glad it was over, though not so much that the melee would take place just after lunch. Watching as Jon, Joy, and Loras walked from the stands, she again wished for nothing more than to be able to follow them. The smile and nod Jon gave her and Sansa not enough to make them feel reassured. Again, though, her grandmother stepped in and they were taken to lunch, instead of the back where Jon had headed off to. Not that any of them had any appetite to eat. "Grandmother, shouldn't we?" she asked, and she felt her grandmother's hand on her shoulder. "We should, but we mustn't. Not yet." "Later, Margie, we can speak with him later," her grandmother said, and again she reluctantly accepted. Sansa did too, and she was surprised at that, but she quickly explained that he had others around him and they all rushing to him would be suspicious. On another day, she'd have been proud of her friend for seeing the politics of the situation. Today, though, she was not. Instead, it was just another reminder of why she was not allowed to do what she knew was right, and she wasn't in the mood to welcome it. It was Willis who found the solution, telling them that they going to wish Jon well in the melee was something anyone would expect, even more so with Loras competing also. Arriving at the tent, she found more people than she expected, and fewer of the ones she had thought would be there. She had thought Joy would still be there and the Lannisters also, but there were none of them here. For now, at least. Instead, it was Jon, Loras, Cregan, Brienne, and Robb. All the competitors and no family, no friends who were not taking part, and she wondered why that was. Moving inside the tent, she saw Jon putting on his armor, Prince Tommen standing by his side as Jon explained how to him. In the corner, Ser Barristan and Ser Arthur spoke, and it took them time to see her and Sansa. "I came to wish you all well," she said, while Sansa hugged Jon, and she did the same to Loras, whispering in his ear to see if Jon was doing likewise as he looked. "How is he?" "Determined," Lord said back. "Prince Tommen, can you and Ser Barristan check the lists and see who it is I should fear?" Jon said, with a smile, looking to the prince. "Are you afraid, Sir Jon?" the prince asked, his voice troubled. "Of course not. My prince, I have my squire to help me do I not," Jon said, mussing the boy's hair and making him laugh as he embarrassed and ran off. They were gone no more than a moment when she ran over and grabbed him and held him tightly, Jon softly stroking her back as she did so. "I'm well, Marge. Truly, I've dealt with it," he said softly. "Jon, I'm so sorry. I wished I should have been, she said, and he kissed her cheek as he whispered in her ear. "You are," he said, and she looked at him to see him nod. "You are always," he said, his hand touching the favor on his belt. Should you compete?" she asked, and very quickly learned she'd not been the first to ask him this. "I know people are worried about me, and I'm grateful for it. Truly, I'd not do this if I felt I couldn't. I'd back out. Make an excuse. Trust me, I would," he said, and she nodded. She heard Cregan tell her that the prince was on his way back, and she moved to speak to Loras once more, her brother nodding when she did so. "Sir Jon, the Great Jon and Small Jon and the Blackfish," Sir Roland Storm and Tommen said as he looked to Ser Barristan to make sure he had it right. "Lady Daisy Lannister," the prince said a moment later. "You see, I knew my squire would see me right. Excellent work. My prince, I can surely win it all now," Jon said, and she wasn't sure if he was really that confident or if it was just for the prince's benefit. "As long as you keep away from Daisy's mace," Loras said, and she watched as Jon crinkled his eyes and moved to her brother. "I was going to distract her with you, my friend, use you as my shield," Jon said, wrapping his arms around Loras from behind and winking at the prince and making him giggle. "Get off me, you fool," Loras said, laughing as he pushed Jon away. She smiled when he looked to her and felt more relaxed as they stood there, even when the Blackfish and Bran came to speak to them. Sansa talking to her brother as Robb and Jon spoke with the Blackfish. Lady Winifred and Lady Wella came by to wish them all well, and she watched jealously as Robb and his betrothed were able to share time alone together. Jon's eyes on them, and then her as they did so, and she saw him touch her favor more than once. When it came time to leave, she almost couldn't bring herself to. Wanting to take him with her, to keep him from the melee and shield him from any possible harm. Instead, though, she watched as he hugged Sansa and whispered in her ear, and she saw them look to her. He then walked over to her, and with his words bid her farewell, while with his eyes he tried to tell her that all would be well. "I thank you for the kind words, my lady. I trust you will enjoy the day," he said, and she nodded as she looked at him. "I shall do my best to, Sir Jon. I wish you good fortune." "I thank you, my lady. It's greatly appreciated, truly," he said, and she tried to smile back when he smiled at her. She tried to make it true and hoped that she'd succeeded. As they were leaving the tent, they met with Lady Jenna and Joy, who were coming to wish their own good fortunes. Joy smiling when she saw them, only to frown a moment later and move to her. "Pen not Margie," the girl said, and Marjorie smiled a truer smile then. "Thank you, Joy," she said, taking the offered peanut. They were walking back, and as soon as they were out of the earshot of anyone who could overhear, Sansa grabbed her hand and whispered in her ear, "Jon told me to tell you that all will be well. He won't take risks, and he promises he'll walk from the field unharmed. He told me that he carries a favor which has brought him nothing but luck since he was given it. Today won't be any different," Sansa whispered, and she hugged her and nodded her head. They took their seats and readied for the competitors to line up, Marjorie looking to see the king's excitement as the moment drew closer. Sansa grabbed her hand, and she was glad of it, the comfort of it, and knowing that, like her, Sansa only wished for those she cared about to be safe. She looked around to see she was not the only one who was worried. Joy sat between her father and Cregan's mother, Jaime with Genna and Willa, and Winifred with their grandfather. All of them looked out at the open field, and Marjorie closed her eyes and began to pray. She asked the warrior to give him strength, and the mother to watch over him, the maiden to protect her love, and the father to give him courage. The crone to give him the wisdom to not do anything reckless, and the smith to give him the tools he needed to win. To the stranger, her prayer was far simpler. Stay away. King's Landing, 207 AC. Jaina's. While Jaime and Jon worried about Jon's well-being, she found herself just wishing this whole thing was over with, that they were gone from this place and back in the West. Gerritsen and Walder were far too excited for the squires' duels, and while she could understand it, she found she had no desire for them to be warriors. Looking at Emmon sitting beside her, she for the first time found herself wishing her children took more after their father. With Jon, she didn't fear for him physically or even mentally, if she was being totally honest. The rage she felt for the fat stag and falcon wasn't blinding, nor forcing him to do reckless things, as Jaime had suggested. If anything from what she'd seen, his anger and rage was well under control and focused where it should be. Her worries, therefore, were more for what everyone else would feel should he be hurt. Even were it minor, they'd reach badly, she thought. So full of worry were they for him in the first place that they'd see it as worse than it may be. She could see Sansa and Marjorie were far too nervous as they sat in their seats. Joy held her father's hand, and Jaime was more worried about Jon than he was his wife. It was as if sense had abandoned them in a way, and she supposed that was true to an extent. "Do you think Jon can win, Mother?" Tian asked, and she smiled as he looked at her boy. I do. Did you bet on him?" she asked. "Him and Loras," Jin said, as Walder added that he'd done the same. She was glad of that. While they had a connection with Jon, he wasn't the only one who had trained them. Loras too playing his part. Looking to Joy once again, she found herself worrying for her most of all. Her niece was perhaps the closest of them all to Jon, and she had been so proud of her earlier that day, how she had comforted him when the stag had presented that horror show, holding his hand and speaking to him. Jenna had no doubt had Joy not been beside him then, the fat stag would have felt a dragon's rage today. Though it was only a temporary respite, it seemed to take an age for the competitors to make their way out to the grounds, Gianna looking to see those she cared about amongst them. Jon stood with Cregan, Brienne, Loras, and his brother, and she felt that apart from Brienne, none of them looked big enough to be out there. But jousting and melees were the way of the realm, and not even her own sons would be spared them before too long. "Your graces, my lord and ladies, good men and women of King's Landing in the realm, His Grace Robert Baratheon, the first of his name, King of the Andals, Rhaegar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the Realm, welcomes you all to the tourney of King's Landing 29-7 AC, the tourney to celebrate the death of the last dragon. By His Grace's command, the melee will now take place. With a prize of 20,000 gold dragons, it has brought notable warriors from throughout the realm. Representing the Vale Lord Yakshan Royce and his sons and Sir Brynden Tully the Blackfish. Representing the Reach, Lord Randall Tarley, Sir Baylor Hightower, Lord Loras Tyrell, and Sir Aaron Florent. Representing the West, Lady Daisy Lannister, Lord Roland Craighall and his son Sir Lyle the Strongboar, Sir Flemond Brax, and Sir Jon Snow, who has wagered the king that he'd win the day. Representing the North, Lord Jon Umber the Great John and his son the Small John, and Sir Walder Allers. Representing the Stormlands, Lord Beric Dondarrion, Sir Rosalind Storm, Sir Rosalind Swan, and Lady Brienne Tarth. Representing the Riverlands, Lord Edmure Tully, Sir Patrick Mollister, Sir Mark Piper, and Sir Hugo Vance. From the Crownlands and representing the Crown, Sir Naras Oakheart of the Kingsguard, Sir Justin Massey of the Kingsguard, Sir Richard Horp of the Kingsguard, and Thoros of Mayor. My lords, my ladies, I give you the melee. The melee, Rob. It was chaos and far different than the squire's melee. Not only were the blows far heavier, but he was soon at an even bigger disadvantage than power alone. These men were far more experienced than he, and were it not for his cousin fighting alongside him, then he would have fallen by now. Ahead of him, Brienne and Loras were fighting alongside each other, and beside him, Cregan was helping him do the same. Sir Walder was fighting alone against a big man, and as for Jon, his brother was taking on more than one. It took a lot for him to fight down his instinct to help, and he could see with Loras, Brienne, Sir Walder, they too were having the same feelings he was. Cregan was more concentrated on the opponent in front of him, and Robb was thankful for that. As he deflected a blow, he began to think back on Sirev's words, trying to allow them to be his guide. Distracted is when the fight comes. Should you be distracted when the fight comes? Boy, do you know what you'll be? Syrio asked. Dead? Robb replied. Very dead, Syrio said as he placed the wooden sword to his neck. He moved out of range and began to glide as best he could, his movement smooth and unhurried while his opponent grew even angrier. He deflected a blow from the mace and went for a leg sweep, only to find he didn't have the strength to take the man to the ground. So instead he slammed his sword on the man's back, and when he turned angrily, he slammed it on his hand, watching as the mace fell to the ground. Yield? He asked, raising the sword. Hey, well fought, lad, the man said as he walked from the grounds. Robb moved forward, and looking back at his brother, he sighed. Were it not for his promise, he'd be over there helping, but he had given his word, and so had the others. Today, Jon was a stranger to them all, and as he faced the Stormlander in front of him, all he could do was hope that Jon knew what he was doing. Brienne, the first opponent she beat, was so easy she wondered why he'd even bothered enter. Had he simply faced lesser opponents all his life and convinced himself that he was far better than he truly was? Or was the lure of the coin something he couldn't resist? Either way, it mattered not, and he had yielded and limped from the grounds, and she found less time to dwell on it than she had expected. I've never beaten a lady before, the man from the Reach said, his voice full of pompous surety. I've never beaten an apple before either, she said, with a smile as the Fossoy knight frowned. When you go to the back, tell them Sir Tanton was who sent you on your way, he said smugly. Gods do all you knights from the Reach talk so damn much, she said as she moved towards him. The knight was more practiced than the man she'd beaten earlier. His blade worked good, but she'd faced far better than he. She had him beat in strength too, which he seemed unable to accept, trying his best to prove it false. Soon it became more about that than about any actual skill. The blows being parried and thrusts and repaistes long forgotten. Instead, it was almost two-handed blows they caught each other's blades with, the sound of them crashing down on each other reverberating throughout the field. Brienne felt herself breathing heavily, the sheer effort both of them were putting in, taking far more out of them than a fight should have. Eventually, after a particularly hard blow, she managed to knock his sword from his hand. Moving quicker than he, she placed her blade at his chest and watched as he yielded quickly. Turning and hoping for a breather, she saw that while Loras had watched her back and kept anyone from sneaking up on her, in doing so they drifted apart, and as she moved towards him, she glanced around the field. She could see Sir Walder fighting in the distance, and Lord Robin Cregan off to the left. Looking to see where Jon was, she found him facing three men, the one in the middle wearing the brown trout, and she laughed until she saw a man wearing a black one come towards her. My lady, shall we? The Blackfish said. I'd be honored, Sir Brynden, she said. She would have liked to have been breathing more evenly and to have been less tired, But it was not to be, and she raised her sword and made ready to face a legend. While she may have held the edge in strength in everything else, it was soon clear he had her beat. Speed, technique, and experience. The blades flew through the air, parry, feint. She moved back and tried a riposte, only for it to be blocked. Soon it was clear she was outmatched, her blows tiring while he did not, and she found herself more on the defensive than offensive. She fell for a leg sweep, and as she crawled away and got ready to rise, she saw the loose stones and picked them up. As the swords hit again, she saw the opening, when she blocked his attack and sent him slightly off balance. Holding the stones in her hand, she got ready to throw them at his face, when he turned, and at the last moment, she instead let them fall to the ground. It proved to be the last thing she did in the melee that day, as he was on to her and his leg sweep took her to the ground hard. "Yield," he said, and she nodded as he helped her back to her feet. "I thank you, sir. It was an honor," she said, and moved to walk away. "You should have used the stones," the Blackfish said as he looked at her. "There was no honor in it, Sir Brynden," she said softly. "Better to keep your life than your honor in a fight, my lady. Out here far too many honorable people die," he said as he walked away. Brienne looked at him before she walked to the back and shook her head. She had heard Bronn say the same and had almost used what he had taught her. She wondered now, after hearing the Blackfish say it, were they right and she wrong? Was honor not something that could be found on a battlefield? And only something you could stick to off of it? Lord, yes. He had been surprised to see Brienne fall, and he felt terrible for it, even though he knew deep down it was not his fault. They had met and discussed their tactics for this fight, all of them deciding to stick together only for Jon to be the one to tell them no. "What do you mean, no?" he asked angrily. "We can't, I see that now, and I've learned it, and while it's hard to accept, we have no choice," Jon said. "This wasn't what I meant, Jon." "No, but you were right, so tomorrow I wish you to do something different. Pair up, just you and one other, and see how far that takes you. See if that distracts you, and if you lose your partner, then fight alone, and see if there is a difference," Jon said. "Brienne?" he asked, and she nodded while he saw Robb do it to Cregan, and then he looked to Walder, expecting him to do so with Jon, only for the large knight to say nothing. "Walder?" Robb asked before he could. "I've asked Walder, and now I'm going to ask you all. No matter what happens tomorrow, no one is to come to my aid. No one," Jon said, and he got up and walked over to him, his face red with anger. "No, this is fucking ridiculous. This is not what I fucking meant, Jon, and you know it," he said, looking at him. "This has nothing to do with that, Loras. This is for me. It's something I need to do. I need to learn this lesson, and far better I learn it out there in a melee than later on. If I'm wrong, if I've made a mistake, then only my pride will be hurt. Well, unless someone catches me and I end up with more than a bruised ego." Jon laughed, though he couldn't bring himself to join in. "Jon?" "Please, Loras," Jon said, and he nodded. So even when he saw the three men come to his friend, he had done nothing, and instead he moved with Brienne and made sure no one came up on her from behind. Over the course of the fight he had with the lad from the Vale, he found himself drifting further and further from her, for a moment thinking the lad had done so on purpose, only to find it was just the natural flow of the fight. By the time he'd dealt with him, Brienne had yielded to the Blackfish, and he knew even him watching her back would have made no difference to that fight. She'd have faced him regardless, and so he took comfort in that, and even more in the sight of the big-eared fox. He moved quickly to make sure it was he that Seared faced, feeling the fire rise in him as he did so. "A flower for me to pluck. A pity it's not the golden rose, though," Sauron said with a smirk which Loras soon wiped from his face. "Had I a thing for women with mustaches, then I'd say the same for your own sister Sarierin, but I see even her husband could only bring himself to lay with her the once." Sarierin almost growled as he came at him, and Loras would normally feel bad about what he had said. But not only had the fox insulted his sister, it was as Bronn said, "You fight with all the tools you have." The blows were angry and misplaced, easy to dodge and take advantage of, and so take advantage he did. He caught Sir Doran hard on the thigh and the arm. He moved quickly and caught his helm, slowing him down even more. The kick he caught him in the leg, while not taking his feet from him, did at least force him to limp for the rest of the fight. "And I thought foxes were cunning and clever. Perhaps you need a new sigil. Sigrin. Maybe an oryx or something more in line with your ears. A rabbit, perhaps," he said, and when he came at him, Loras was ready for him. He dodged the blow, and the kick he gave him to the back of the leg may have broken something. Were it not for the padding, he would have heard an even louder scream from the man. Not that he cared or that it allowed him to stop what he wished to do, as he then swept the man's other leg and watched as he fell. "Yield, Sir Aaron," he said to no reply, and so made to step on the man's injured leg. "Yield. Aye, I fucking yield, Flower, but this isn't over." "Is it not? It looks over to me," he said as he moved away to face his next opponent, and seeing the runes on the armor he was glad it was Ser de Robert and not Lord Yat. Kurgan. Though the field had begun to whittle down and the melee had been going on for some time, he felt fresh and ready to face anyone. So far he had taken 4 men out, 2 from the Reach, 1 from the Stormlands, and 1 from the West. He had watched his cousin's back and made sure that no one had snuck up on him, and he felt confident he could go for some more time. The man who moved towards him looked impressive, though. His armor was covered in runes and his movements assured. Cregan readied his blade and watched as the man took his stance. "Ser Endar Royce," the knight said as he stood in front of him. "Cregan Sand," he said, and the knight nodded. "Shall we?" the knight said, and he gave him his nod, and they quickly began. He was certainly the best of the men here he'd faced, even if he was far from the best he'd ever faced. Cregan knew, though, one mistake, one lapse of concentration, would be the end of his day, and in a true fight, it would cost even more. So he focused on Ser Endor's stance, on his footwork, and on his blade, and he began moving quickly from side to side with his attacks as he looked for an opening. The first flurry ended up with both of them realizing that this was not going to be easy. Andor thrust, and he parried. He feinted, and Andor ignored it. He caught him once, and that was the only hit that either of them got in. The second was much faster, as both of them ramped up the speed, thinking that would see them right. As they took a breath after it, they both smiled, looking at each other as they realized it would not, and Andor nodded to him as he spoke. "It's an honor crossing blades, with you, Cregan. You too, Ser Endar." He moved left and thrust right, only to find nothing but air, and Andor having anticipated it, and moved away, and only his reflexes saving him from taking a hard hit. Changing his stance, he began to try little things, feints and doubt feints, trying to look weak and tired to draw him in, and he found to his dismay that none of these seemed to work. The blades clashed again, and he jumped back when Andar tried to take his feet, and then Cregan almost looked on shocked when he managed to take Andar's. "Yield?" he asked, and Andar nodded. "A good fight, Cregan. I wish you good fortune," Andar said. "You too, sir," he said, smiling when the knight walked away. As he turned, though, the smile left his face when he saw Robb crossing blades with an all-too different foe, one he didn't think either of them was ready to face. Robb's sword work, no match for the flaming blade of Thoros of Myr. When he reached them, it was over, his cousin having yielded, and so he went into the fight, seeking revenge. Pretty soon he had learned 2 things. Anger was only a help if you could focus it, and fighting a man with a fiery sword was far different than any other fight. Not only did you have to worry about the sword and the normal things you did during a fight, you then had the added bonus of fearing being burnt every single time the blade came anywhere close to you, the heat of the fire forcing you ever further back and making you flinch. How long Robb had lasted against the priest, he didn't know. What he did was that, during the fight, he lost all sense of skill or learning with a blade he had ever known. Instinct was no help either, as the fire trumped that, your instinct, when faced with fire, was to recoil. He almost dropped his sword when Thoros' blade came close to his face, and that in the end was enough to cost him the fight. Thoros quickly taking advantage of him, trying to readjust by catching his other hand, and Cregan on instinct trying to put out a flame that wasn't there. "I yield," he said, when Thoros held the sword to his chest, and even though it was feet away, he still moved back. "My god will be happy to hear it," Thoros said. Cregan watched as he walked to a bag at the side, and placing the sword on the dirt, the flame went out. The priest picking out another, and he looked as the flames appeared on the sword where just moments earlier there had been none. Walking to the back, he found Brienne and Robb waiting for him, and after accepting the mug of water, he like them looked back to the fight inside. Jaehaerys Targaryen! With 3 of them competing in the melee, Jon had asked Sansa and Bran to allow the wolves to go hunt in the Kingswood. Both of them had agreed, and so he knew that right now that they were stalking a deer which had no chance, and that all 5 of them were enjoying being a pack once more. He had almost laughed when they'd then been introduced during the melee, Robert basically putting a target on his back. Now, as he saw the 3 of them coming towards him, he knew the target was already there, and in this instance, he was glad of it. Mark Seiper and Hugo Vance he knew very little about. Richard had said they were part of Edmure's little circle, though, and so, hearing their names, he had expected it. That Edmure would send someone after him was no big surprise. Him competing and coming after him personally, though, certainly was. Look, the bastard of Winterfell, or is it Casterly Rock? Edmure said haughtily. Ah, the floppy fish has come with some friends, though I should have expected it. After all, you can't seem to manage things on your own. Can you, Trout? He said, enjoying the angry glare Edmure gave him. We were only going to beat you a little. For that, however, it's going to be a lot. March said, Really? Well, you can't argue with a confident man, Jank said with a smirk. You should have kept to the squire's duels, bastard. This is for big boys, Hugo Vance said. And you, Sierra, should pick better friends. Last time the floppy fish faced me, he ended on his arse twice, and that was without me even trying. What do you think I'll do to him now? He said, as he swung his sword, and all three of them took a step back, Jane laughing as he looked at them. While Mark and Hugo moved to face him, Edmure held back, be it from fear or waiting to pick his moment. Jay couldn't be sure, though he'd wager it was the former. With his sword in one hand and his knife in the other, he deflected both blows, surprising the two men. He then decided to surprise them even more. Spinning, he caught Sir Mark across the arm and was then past them both and closer to Edmure. He couldn't resist, and so he made to move forward and tried not to laugh as Edmure tripped over his feet as he moved back. Turning back, he ducked a blow from Hugo and jabbed the knife into his shoulder, the blunt blade connecting with bone sending a shockwave up Jack's arm as well as down Hugo's. With Edmure struggling to his feet and Hugo now backing off to allow his arm recover, it was left to him and Mark to have the fight. Jaxley knew if Loras looked to him, he'd think him a hypocrite. All the times he'd spoken to him of showing off in fights, and now here he was. And to all eyes, it would look as if he was doing the same. He hoped, though, that Jaime, Arthur, Walder, and others would see the method in what he was doing. He spun and jumped through the air, twisting to attack Mark's left side before spinning again to attack his right. He then made it look as if he was doing the same again, only to do a full instead of half turn in the air. Marjorie readying for him to attack his left, leaving his right side open, and Jace caught him hard, once, twice, 3 times. Hugo was coming fast from the left, and Edmure from behind, and he closed his eyes and looked to the sky, the door open and the eagle looking down. As he hit Marks once again, he could see them move in, and he waited and then rolled out of the way. With Jay not where he was but a few seconds earlier, Mark's blade caught Edmure hard and Edmure's own blow missed in return. Hugo's didn't as he followed through on his swing and caught Mark across the chest. In the confusion, Jay swept Mark's feet and caught Hugo with a shoulder, and though he didn't catch Edmure as full as he wished, the kick did knock him further back. Yield, he said as he placed the blade to Mark's throat as he tried to get up. Aye, I yield. Jursa didn't waste time. He moved to Hugo and watched as Edmure came running in, waiting until he was close enough. He judged the distance, and once he was sure he threw the knife, catching him flush on the head. With Edmure out of the fight, for now, it left him free to face Hugo and be at the shoulder he had hurt earlier, or that the fight was gone from the man. He quickly seemed to give up. Yelled? He said, holding the blade to him, and Hugo quickly yielded. Alone now with Edmure, he began to have fun. He'd faint and be so blatant about it that only a novice would fall for it, and then he'd laugh as Edmure did. He'd leave himself open so that any competent swordsman would take advantage, and then he'd shake his head when Edmure did not. What it looked like to those who were watching Jay could only imagine. But then as he looked around the field, though, he frowned. How long had he been playing with these fools? He wondered as he swept Edmure's feet from under him. Yield. Fuck you, bastard. Yield, he said again. And the way he shook his head reminded Jack of Walder and his hatred of vegetables, making him laugh even more loudly. I'll never yield to you, bastard. Never, Edmure said. Never say never, Trout, Jack said, as he allowed Edmure up to his feet and looked at him. This could have been so easy. 3 times he spun and 3 times he got inside Edmure's guard. 2 of the hits were on either side of the fish's helm. The third one even harder on the top of it. As Edmure crumpled to the ground, Jay looked out to the stretcher bearers and nodded as they came out. Grabbing his knife from the ground, he walked towards the rest of the fighting and readied himself for a truer test. Walder, During his training with Arthur, he had learned the art of concentrating both on the man in front of you and on the man you were protecting. So despite what Jon had told him and the fact he was facing the Great Jon, Walder had his eyes on his king at all times. That the giant lord of the north had sought him out came as no surprise, the defeat still fresh in his mind. "I think we need to dance again, Sir Walder." "If you say so, my lord," he said, and moved his axe. "I insist on it." He had heard people say the mountain wielded his great sword like it was a short one, and he had seen the chunk of metal that the Great Jon carried on his horse. While the tourney sword was nowhere near as impressive, it was still far larger than some of the other great swords, and Walder wondered if it had been made special. The sound as it hit his axe seemed different too. He swung hard and missed, and only barely dodged the hit the Great Jon aimed at him in return, and like the last time they fought, he knew this was going to be painful. Something the next blow proved as it caught him in the side and knocked him back a few feet. As the Great Jon swung again, though, he caught him twice, once with the blades of the axe and the second time with the shaft. "It'll be my day today, Walder," the Great Jon said, laughing as he dodged his axe. "Perhaps, as long as a Northman wins, I'll be happy." "Aye, me too," the Great Jon said as their weapons clashed once again. Just as the last time they fought, it ended up coming down to strength, when after a block from the Great Jon's blade, they both ended up unarmed as the axe and the great sword fell to the ground. Unlike last time, however, the Great Jon didn't make a move to regain his sword, instead standing in front of him and making sure he couldn't get to his axe. He'd seen the Great Jon wrestle before, had heard from Lord Jaime that he'd done so years earlier when he and Jon had visited Last Hearth. This though was anything but a wrestling match, as the two of them came together and began to punch and kick the other. Walder swept the Great Jon's feet from under him, and before he had a chance to celebrate the feat, he was pulled to the ground with him. A headbutt from the Great Jon had him staggering back, allowing the man time to rise to his feet, and he felt the kick in his side and hoped he'd not broken any of his ribs, coughing and spluttering on the ground. He tried to get his bearing, watching as the Great Jon moved to his sword, and feeling around for any weapon he could find. The stone was large, and he waited until the man bent to pick up the sword, and as he turned to head back towards him, he threw it. "Fuck," the Great Jon said as he fell down on his arse. The force he'd landed was sending a vibration across the ground to where Walder was rising to his own feet. He moved across and grabbed the Great Jon's sword and held to his neck, looking down to see how hurt the man was and relieved to see the smile on his face. "Yield?" "Aye, a hand," the Great Jon asked, and Walder helped him up. "A good fight, my lord," he said, handing him the sword back. "Aye, good fortune, Walder. If you see my boy, knock him on his arse for me." "Well, yeah." "Aye, I will." Walder walked back to his axe and picked it up, breathing heavily all the way. He looked to see Jon knock the trout out, laughing as he moved towards the rest of the fighting, and soon he saw Jon following him. It was Jon who ended up facing the small Jon, Walder finding himself laughing at the exchange. "Who wants to face Goatsbane?" "I'll face ya, you big fool," Jon shouted, and he heard the small Jon laugh. "Where are ya, lad? I can't see ya," the small Jon said, his hands on his eyes as he looked around over Jon's head. "Ah, there you are, all the way down there. Why, this isn't fair, Jon." "I know, but I'll have to make do. Should I put my hand behind my back? Do you think? Would that even the odds?" Jon said, and he'd have loved to just stand, watch, and listen. "Sir Walder." "Sir Lyle," he said, and the dance began again. The strong boar was faster than his father, and stronger too, and soon Walder began to realize that he may indeed have cracked a rib or two. It started to become harder to catch a breath, and to swing his axe. He turned to look to see Jon dancing around the small Jon, the man's blows not coming anywhere near him. Lors was facing a lord from the Stormlands, and Daisy was facing off against Bronze Jon. So Wyn felt himself cough, and he spat blood. He held up his hand. "The day is yours, Sir Lyle. We could fight and move some more, but you'll win, and—" He spat the blood out. "It's a fucking tourney," he said, and Sir Lyle laughed. "It's not how I wish to take the day, Sir Walder, but I'd rather the chance to face you unhurt, perhaps at the Rock sometime." "You can count on it, sir. I wish you good fortune for the rest of the day, Sir Lyle." "I thank you, Sir Walder." He looked back to see Jon still fighting, and he walked stiffly to the back. Robb, Cregan, and Brienne standing there watching the event take place. "Sir Walder?" Brienne asked concernedly. "I think I broke a rib or two. I may need a maester," he said, and he watched as his squire ran off. "You are hurt?" Cregan asked. "Aye, I think I stopped before it got worse." he said, and was happy when the lad brought him some water to drink. Brian helped him to the tent, and the maester who was there confirmed the injury. He'd need to rest up for a few days, and no physical work or sparring for a moon or so. The maester's saying that, while he didn't think them broke, they were damaged and they'd need to heal. That's why you yielded, sir, Brian asked when the maester had left them alone. Our king has far more important fights to come. Brian, I intend to be by his side, and winning a tourney means far less than that. Aye, sir, it does, she said, and she helped him up as they both walked to the seats to watch the rest of the day. Daisy, whether it was her showings in other fights or her being the Lady of Casterly Rock, she wasn't sure, but the quality of opponent she faced was far better this time. Her first was Sir Patrick Lannister, and she nodded and smiled before they began. The heir to Seaguard had shown himself to be far different than his liege, and was someone she considered a friend. Lady Daisy, Sir Patrick said. Sir Patrick, she replied. I figured if I were to get beat this day, then better it be from a warrior I respect than to fall to someone lucky enough to catch me unawares, he said, and she could relate to that. Even if it were a lady, she asked with half a grin. To a lady such as yourself, Lady Daisy. Aye, shall we? Patrick was fast, but she and her mace were faster, and she didn't pull her blows in the exchanges. She blocked and then used the shaft or aimed for the shoulder and the arm. When the sword fell to the ground, it was from repeated rather than single shots, and she swore she saw the man smile as he yielded. The day is yours, my lady, Patrick said with a bow before he left. Not that Daisy had a chance to enjoy her victory. As soon she found herself face to face with a knight from the Stormlands, though this one was far less friendly than Sir Patrick. He basically growled at her as he attacked with his morning star, and were it not for the battling swans on his sigil, then she'd not even have known his name. Sir Balin Swan, though being a decent hand with a morning star, should have kept to the archery, and she soon began to find a rhythm. That he had been rude didn't bother her. That he smirked at her did. And so she caught him hard on the shoulder and then on the opposite arm. She slammed her mace against his thigh and then his chest, and lastly, she caught him close to his elbow. The morning star fell, and she walked over and listened to him yield, and then as she turned, she heard him laugh. My lady, I'd be honored to face you, Lord Yane said, and she nodded and moved towards him. The last time she'd faced him, she had the small Jon with her, and the Lord had underestimated her greatly. This time she was alone, and he was taking it far more seriously. He'd come prepared too. Behind his back, he carried his sword, and in his hand, he held a mace, and they began to fight. The two maces crashed against each other, and soon she got the edge. Lord Yats may have practiced with a mace, but on Bear Island they were born with them in their hands. She was an artist, and as she moved left and swung right or underhand, the Bronze Lord retreated. Daisy smiled when she took the mace from his hand and moved to take the win, only for the sword blow to catch her unawares, and before she knew it, the blade was placed on her throat. Yield, my lady, Lord Yag said, and she almost shook her head, though it would have been in anger at herself. I yield, my lord, she said, and Bronzion gave her a small bow before he walked away. She had forgotten about the sword, so focused had she been on the mace she'd forgotten about the sword. As she walked back, she looked to see Loras running over to her, his day done as well. Who? She asked. Sierra Roland Storm, he said, though he didn't seem upset. You? Bronzion. The two of them looked back to the field. Sir Lyle was facing Sir Roland. Bronzion was now squaring off against Thoros. Sir Baelor was facing the Blackfish, and Jon was facing the Small Jon. Two of the King's Guard were facing off against each other, and the other was facing Lord Turley. She tried not to reflect that this was her poorest showing, and instead she concentrated on Jon and the Small Jon, laughing as Goatsbane barely dodged an attack. Come, let's get to the back and try and watch the rest of this, she said, and saw Loras nod. James here is Targaryen. Fighting against the Small Jon was fun. He was so easy to rile up, and Jay was using all the lessons he'd had with Bronn to annoy him. It was causing him to put far too much power into his strokes and allowing for Jay to move him how he wished and to conserve his own energy. Did you really move this slow when we were younger? James said as the Small Jon tried and failed to catch him with a swing. Stop fucking moving, Snow, the Small Jon shouted. Why can't you catch me? I'd have thought you'd had all that practice with the goats. Jack said with a chuckle. Snow, he shouted, and charged towards him. Jay waited until he was close, and at the last moment he ducked and rolled, the Small Jon's swing going far over where he had just been, and almost spinning the large man around. As he hurried to get back into position, Jay used a reverse sweep, and the small Jon and his sword fell to the ground, both of them ending some distance from each other. "Yield?" he asked, and could see the surprise on the small Jon's face. "You cheeky little fucker. You did that on purpose," the small Jon said with a laugh. "I had to. You're very large," he said with a chuckle, before holding his hand out. "Go, beat the rest of the fuckers or me, and me, Day, will beat the fuck out of you later on." Jay looked over the rest of the field. The Blackfish was fighting Sir Baelor and Bronze Jon against Thoros. Almost everyone seemed to have an opponent, and then he heard a voice from behind him and turned to see Randyll Tarly standing there. "It's to be you, then," Randyll said with a bit of disgust in his voice. "That it is Lord Tarly. Very well. A bastard knight will have to do," the prickly lord said, and Jay found himself face to face with a man he knew he'd need on his side. His first instinct was to let the man win, to throw the match and give Tarly a reason to think better of him. But he knew more of Tarly than that. It would be far better to beat him easily than to allow him to win. When he found out the truth of him, the defeat would be something he'd look on differently. A victory would be something he'd use against him. Taking his stance, he nodded, and the lord came to him. The blow was powerful but easily deflected, and he saw the look of surprise on Tarly's face. The next one was even harder, but again he deflected it easily, and he saw Tarly look at him a little more closely. The half-helm he wore covered most of his face, and he knew what he was about to do would annoy Arthur and Jaime. But after deflecting the third blow and moving quickly out of range, he reached up and took the helm off and threw it to the ground. "What are you doing, boy?" he heard Tarly say. And Jade said nothing, and just moved closer. As the swords clashed, he began to sing softly. Not enough that it would carry, but enough that Randyll Tarly would hear him loud and clear. "High in the halls of the kings that are gone." He thrust his sword and forced Randyll to step back, the lord looking at him oddly. Jenny would dance with her ghosts. The ones she had lost, and the ones she had found. He spun and caught the lord across the arm before spinning the other way and almost catching the other side. And the ones who had loved her the most. He began to move faster now as the lord looked at him, his blows coming left, then right again, a spin and a swipe from the side forcing Randyll further on the defensive. The ones who'd been gone for so very long. She couldn't remember their names. His sword moved so fast that Randyll couldn't see what was a feint and what was an actual strike. Some getting through and others being barely deflected. They spun her around on the damp old stones. Spun away all her sorrow and pain. Jack spun and jumped with his blade, the sword catching Randyll more and more as the lord looked at him. With a final spin, he caught the lord's arm, forcing him to turn slightly, and then he took his legs from under him. And she never wanted to leave. "Yield, my lord," he said to the lord with his sword pointed to his neck. Jane's smiling face looking down at him, and he saw it then, the recognition. Randyll's eyes going wide. "I yield," Randyll said as Jane leaned down to help him to his feet. "Zertrud Lonmouth will contact you, my lord. There is much we must speak on about my father," he said softly, and saw Randyll nod vigorously. After helping him up, Jay took the cheers from the crowd and moved to where the last few fights were taking place. Thoros had beaten Bronze Jon and was facing the Blackfish, and Sir Richard had beaten Sir Ritz and was facing Sir Reldon, who had defeated the Strongboar, leaving Jay with no opponent. Closing his eyes, he took a knee and went looking for the doors and found more than one. The wolves were busy, and so it was birds. He went to. All through the stands, people were speaking of the fights and making wagers on who would win, and he was happy to hear some speaking of him. He flew over the grounds and looked down at the fights below him and watched as Thoros' blade came dangerously close to the Blackfish's face and as Sir Richard yielded to Sir Roland. As soon as the King's Guard walked away, Jay stood up and walked over to the giant bastard of Night Song, looking up at the man even from a distance away. "Sir Roland," he said with a nod when he reached the knight. "Sir John," the knight said back to him. "May the best bastard win, sir," he said with a smile, and heard the man laugh. "Aye, good fortune to you, Sir John." "You too, sir." His your lord was faster than the small John. And unlike with his friend from the north, the last thing John wished was to make this man angry. Instead, he relied even more on his speed, moving in and out of his guard and ducking, jumping, spinning, and rolling to avoid being hit. After a few moments, he saw how frustrated the giant knight was getting, and though his own blows were landing, they were having no effect. He then took a risk which almost cost him the match, moving fast to make the knight have to constantly readjust. He aimed to throw him off balance. Unfortunately, a leg sweep wouldn't work, and he knew he'd need to push him, and it needed to be timed just right. It wasn't. Whether it was still him being linked to the bird somehow or a sixth sense, he couldn't be sure. All he knew was it saved him, and so instead of the punch knocking him out, it only grazed him. Not that it didn't hurt or knock him to the ground, but he remained conscious, and when Sir Weldon walked over to him, he saw the opening and took it. As he reached him and went to place his sword to his neck, Jay pushed himself and slid forward, ending up between the men's legs. Once there, he aimed his punch upwards. He felt the weight of the man as he fell on him, and it winded him for a moment, the knife held to Sir Weldon's neck, getting him to yield and making Sir Weldon roll off him. "Well fought, lad," Sir Weldon said as he held his balls in his two hands, his strangled voice in complete contrast to the smile on his face. "Thank you, sir," he said as he got up and felt the blood from his eye, the gauntlet having somehow caught him on the scar. Jay shook his head and the tie from his hair fell loose. He then reached his hand up to the cut and felt the blood drip into his palm. He looked over to see Thoros walk away and figured that he had lost to the Blackfish, though he couldn't see the other man anywhere. Looking again, he saw that Thoros was walking over to a bag and taking out a fresh sword, and he watched as the Red Priest lit up the blade, the flames burning brightly as he moved toward him. Sir Roland was helped off the field, and Jake stood there and waited for the Red Priest to come and face him, shaking his head to feel the blood slowing down, though it still dripped from his eye. He looked to the crowd and raised his hand up and heard them cheer, whether they were happy he was fit to continue or just wished to see another match, though he couldn't be sure. "My prince, shall we?" Thoros said softly, his smile beaming as he looked at him, and Jay smiled back at him, glad he'd spoken so low. "We shall," he said, and they began to fight. The blade came close to him, and yet he never feared it, the heat not even registering, and soon he began to get the upper hand. Thoros's strikes were precise and strong, but without the threat of the flames, they weren't nearly as effective. So little did he fear the flames, that when it came near his face, he didn't even flinch, and it was Thoros who did, instead of he. The Red Priest almost dropping his sword, and then J.A. knocking it to the ground a moment later. "Yield?" he asked, and Thoros nodded, looking at him with a strange expression. "You truly are his chosen," Thoros said, and Jay didn't understand what he meant by that, at least until he looked to the sword on the ground. The flames burned far brighter than they had when Thoros had set the sword alight. The heat also could now be felt from where they stood. As he moved to the blade, he saw his blood drip on it, and the flame grew brighter still. He kicked the sand over it and was relieved when it went out, and he turned to look to the crowd. "The winner of the melee, Sir Jon Snow," he heard the herald say, and yet in his mind he was thinking back to the flames and wondering what they had looked like to those in the crowd. King's Landing, 2097 AC. Marguerite, she like the rest of the crowd cheered when Jon took the day, the king probably the loudest of them all. But unlike the others, she cheered almost as much out of relief he hadn't been harmed as she had for the win itself. Though soon she found herself frowning and looking worriedly as Jon took the plaudits. The cut over his eye looked deep to her, the blood on his face almost making her cry out. Had her grandmother and Sansa not grabbed her hands, she was sure she would have. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, before looking back at her husband. Jon, she found, was looking up to her, a smile on his face, and she hoped that meant the injury wasn't too serious. As the king stood up, Marguerite looked around at the others. Lord Jaime and the Lannisters seemed unconcerned, as did her grandmother. Joy, like her, and Sansa seemed the most worried of them all. "Congratulations, lad. Well done, and well worth the wait," the king said with a large smile on his face. "Thank you, your grace," Jon said, and as the crowd cheered once more, he looked back up to her and then nodded as he turned to leave. She was glad the day was over with, and as the crowd began to disperse, she grabbed Sansa's hand, and with her grandmother and their guards, they made their way to the tents. A little in front of her, she could see the Lannisters doing the same thing, Joy almost dragging her father to get there even more quickly. Marguerite couldn't help but smile at that, knowing that the girl would give Jon a piece for her mind just as much as she and Sansa would. Arriving at the tent, she saw Lord Jaime walk back out of it and heading off to where his wife was changing. Nervously, she stepped inside to see Joy sitting watching closely as the master checked the wound, and Sansa looked to her and nodded before she rushed over. She was happy to see Loras come directly to her and her grandmother, her brother not looking worried at all, which made her even more relieved. "He is well, sister, a small cut, nothing to worry about," Loras said, and she looked to see if he was just telling her what she wished to hear. "You're sure, Loras?" she asked, having not been able to judge if that was what he was doing. "I'm positive. It won't even leave a bigger scar, Marge. It's the old one just reopening," he said, and she looked on as Jon was making Joy laugh at something he said. It took some time before she got the chance to even get close to him. Joy, Sansa, Jerion, Jenna, and Prince Tommen, all crowding him and leaving her a little out of the circle. Soon, though, people began to move. Jon looking to Ser Barristan, who took Prince Tommen from the tent, the Maester leaving, and then once it was only people who knew the truth, Jon got up and walked over to her. Feeling his arms around her, she felt herself relax into them before she moved him back so she could see the cut for herself. It looked far too deep for her liking, and the stitches the Master had used to close it made it look even worse. She saw Jon try to smile reassuringly at her, but felt her anger rise. He'd been stupid. He had removed his helm and taken a serious risk of being badly harmed. Why did you take your helm off? You know better than that, Jon. What were you thinking?" she said, the anger in her voice, far more pronounced than she had expected. "I didn't mean to. I meant to, but I thought I'd have time to put it back on," he said apologetically. "But you didn't, Jon. You risked far too much, even after promising me you would not," she said, and even though it hurt to see him look at her that way, she felt he deserved her rebuke. "I'm sorry, Marge, truly. I had a plan. I saw an opening and I'm sorry. What if it had been worse, Jon? What if you'd been hurt worse? How do you think I'd feel?" she said, and had she looked around her, she'd have laughed, as in the overcrowded tent. People tried to give them some privacy. "I know, I am sorry, Marge, I didn't think." Jon set his eyes looking into hers for forgiveness, or at least acceptance of what he did, and she found she wasn't ready to do either just yet. "No, Jon, you did not," she said, as she looked at him and then turned to walk away, his hand reaching for hers, which she ignored. She knew she was overreacting. He'd not been hurt seriously, and deep down she knew he had a reason for taking his helm off, and she wondered what that reason was. Her heart was beating fast, though, at the thoughts of what could have happened to him, of how badly he could have been hurt. As she walked back with her grandmother and her guards, Sansa staying with her brother, for now, she felt she'd at least made her displeasure and worry clear. "You did very well in there, Marjorie," her grandmother said. "Did I?" she asked, not sure if she was doing the right thing or if she had overreacted. "You did. He needs to learn that it's not just himself he risks so. It's you too. Where he goes, you follow even if you can't take the field beside him. He carries you with him. Does he not?" "He does, grandmother, always," she said, looking to her grandmother, who smiled and kissed her cheek. "Then he needs to be aware of this, and your rebuke will work far better than any of the others he'll get this day." "Others?" she asked. "Oh, there will be others. He's not faced mine yet," her grandmother said, and Marguerite smirked at that, having been on the end of one or two from her grandmother herself. They arrived back at their mains to find her father, mother, and Willis had all arrived a good deal before them. Willis coming over to see how she was, and Marjorie not really in the mood to explain her feelings to anyone else just now. Instead, she looked to her grandmother, who sent her on her way, and then she left and went to her room. Laying down on her bed and finding the tears coming soon afterward, though whether she cried over fighting with Jon or out of relief he wasn't seriously harmed, she wasn't sure. By the time Sansa came back to the manse, she was far more composed, and when her friend came to see her, Marguerite was eager to find out if Jon had said anything after she left. "How was he after I'd gone, Sansa?" she asked, biting her lip. "Upset, I think." He was quiet, only really speaking to Joy and to Ser Arthur, Sansa said. "Did he not speak to you?" she asked. "No, he did. He was apologetic. But he was quiet. I think what you said," Sansa said before she interrupted. "I'm sorry, Sansa. I didn't mean—" "No, you were right. Someone needed to say it to him. He needed to hear it, and I'm glad he heard it from you," Sansa said determinedly. "You are?" she asked. It had to be you, Marge. You out of all of us." They spoke a little more then, Sansa telling her no one else was harmed and asking her if she'd be going to the feast that night, Marguerite confirming they would. She asked Sansa had she been to see her mother yet, her friend shaking her head, and she knew better than to push it just then. Sansa had confided in her about her feelings for her mother and how she'd still not forgiven her over what she had said, though Marguerite knew she wished to. When the knock came to the door, she thought for the briefest moment that it would be Jon. She'd see when she opened it. finding her grandmother there instead and trying not to laugh at the put-out look on her face when her expression had obviously changed. "Grandmother, a note from the Queen. You're invited to tea on the morrow," her grandmother said, and Marjorie nodded, something she would have to endure. Unfortunately, she thought as she looked at the note, King's Landing 2097 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen. Joy had been angry with him. Jaqena, Jirayan, Jayanatu. But from Joy, it was so rare that it had taken him aback. To hear her tell him off so simply and directly, and to see the expression of worry in her face, had cut him deeply. More so than any words he could have heard ever from Jaime, he found to his surprise. So when Marjorie arrived, he had been glad of it and had needed her more than ever right then. That she had been as angry at him as Joy was didn't surprise him. If anything, he'd expected it. What he hadn't expected was that he'd not be able to remove that anger to calm her down and reassure her, nor that she would express it so clearly that she then just walked away had hurt, and he knew then just how much he'd fucked up. That it hadn't been deliberate was no excuse. He had taken his helm off thinking he'd get the chance to put it back on. He didn't, and things could have gone much worse. "I know, don't," he said to Arthur as they walked from the tent. "Jon, I know, Daemon, nothing you can say to me right now will make me feel better or make me feel worse. I know," he said, and thankfully Arthur nodded. As they walked through the streets to the tavern, he felt him coming toward him and turned to see Ghost racing ahead of Joris, who was trying in vain to keep up. He was glad the White Wolf slowed down before he got to him. Had he not then, he'd have knocked him some distance. Such was his momentum. Reaching down to rub his fur, Jay felt a sense of peace come over him, an easing of his troubled heart, and he knelt down to look into the wolf's eyes. "Thank you, Ghost," he whispered, and then chuckled when Ghost licked his face, even Arthur laughing a little. The rest of the walk to the tavern was far more pleasant, Jay feeling in a much lighter mood and more people looking to him and Ghost and pointing him out to others. He could hear the voices and the hushed whispers as they passed. "The White Wolf! Sir Jon? He won the melee. Do you think he'll give up that prize also?" By the time they entered the tavern, he had heard them all, and even were it not already his plan for the coin, it would have been then. They took a seat and waited. Richard's man, seeing them and getting up, go fetch him while they waited. Jack, Jers, and Arthur having a drink, while Ghost was given some meat to eat. He never saw Richard enter, only the same man from before who spoke to the serving girl and sent her over. "Perhaps you'd prefer to drink in private, Sir Jon?" the girl asked with a smile, and Jon nodded. Once upstairs, he found Richard already waiting and leaving Ghost at the door. He, Arthur, and George took a seat, and Jay began to get ready to tell them about Tackerley and why he'd removed his helm. "Your injury. It's not serious?" Richard asked. "No, Richard, just a flesh wound," he said with a soft smile. "You were incredibly out there, Jon, the crowd, the things they said about you," Richard said proudly. My helm, Richard, I took it off for a reason. One I've not told Arthur or Jaime about just yet," he said, and Arthur looked to him. "Jon?" Arthur asked. "Totally, Richard. I wish you to meet with him," he said, and saw Arthur look to Richard, and then both of them to him. "You told him?" Arthur asked. "Not exactly. I gave him enough clues to work it out, and then I told him of Richard and that I was my father's son," he said, and waited for the inevitable argument. "How?" Arthur asked. "What?" he said confusedly. "How did you give him clues to helm I get, but that wouldn't have been enough?" Richard asked. "I sang," he said, and Richard laughed loudly, while Arthur just looked at him. "Aye, that it do it, gods, I wish I could have seen Randale's face." Richard said, still laughing. "Richard," Arthur said, shaking his head. "Aye, I know, Arthur. It was reckless, and the melee was no place for it, but it doesn't change that. It's done now, and we've to deal with it, does it?" Richard said. "I had to tell him. Beating him wouldn't have done me any good. Losing to a bastard? No, this needed to be done." James said, and Arthur just looked at him. "I'll speak to Randall once he knows the truth. He'll be on your side. Jon, you'll need to tell Olenna, though," Richard said. "Aye, I will. Richard the Loyalist houses. Who can we trust? Other than who we have already, I think Celtigar and Sunglass, though I'd speak to them after the tourney and have made plans to. I'd not risk the Graftons in the Vale nor the Riverlands houses just yet." Richard said, "How much of the Riverlands do you think, Richard?" Jay asked. "I think Mallister, Blackwood, Brackenwen, and maybe Mooten," Richard said, and Arthur looked at him incredulously. You think them all? Arthur asked. Aye, we've done a decent job with them. As for Edmure, well, after today. Richard laughed. I wish to speak to some of the others, Richard. Is Raymoon here? Montford? Jay asked, and Richard nodded. I'll speak to Olenna about the Reach, and I think I need to tell the Great Jon, he said, and both men looked to him. Is that wise, Jon? Arthur asked. It's needed, Arthur. I'll leave it until we're ready to leave. It'll be the last thing I do, but I need to tell him. As you say, Jon, Arthur said, though he didn't seem convinced. Doran, can we get a message to Oberyn quickly? James here asked, looking to Richard, who nodded before replying. Aye, just Oberyn or Tyrion too. Both. I'll see it done. Your uncle, Jon. He's to marry. The letters are to arrive in the next day or so. Richard said, Tyrion? He asked with a smile on his face. Eddard, Richard said, and the smile got bigger. The letters for Sansa and Robb. You and Bran too, I think he wishes to marry as soon as you can all get north, Richard said. I can't go, Richard. Much though I want to, I cannot. Can you get a letter to him before they arrive? Aye, I'll see it done. They made their way back to the manse after speaking some more. Jae heading straight to talk to Jaime and the others while Arthur and Jorah followed, Walder soon relieving Jorah as his guard. He knew they'd be heading to the feast very soon, and he hoped he'd see and be able to speak to Margaery there. Trying to keep busy for most of the day so he'd forget how he'd hurt her was not being something he was entirely successful with. King's Landing 2097 AC. Catelyn, things hadn't gone to plan since she'd arrived. They'd been welcomed well enough, though, by Jon Arryn and not the king. Lysa had seemed at first to be happy to see them, and then almost as quickly it seemed she really wasn't. Titira had been far too busy to speak to properly, and while she understood it, she was annoyed by it also. Then when she heard her children had arrived, she looked forward to seeing them and waited for them to come to her. That she was still waiting for one of them annoyed her greatly. Robb had come to see her briefly only, hugging her and promising they'd speak once the melee was over with. Rod had come with her uncle, and while Brendan had made it clear he had no wish to be there, her son had almost run to her, and she found herself almost weeping when she saw him. Look at you. Look how much you've grown, she said, kissing his cheek. I'm a squire now, mother. I've need to grow, he said, and even his voice made him seem much older to her. You like it, though? Being a squire for my uncle? You enjoy it? She asked, and he nodded enthusiastically. Very much so, mother. I'll be a knight one day, like Jon, he said. And though she frowned, she held her tongue, for now, her uncle watching far too closely for her to tell Bran the truth about the bastard. You'll come eat with me, won't you? She asked hopefully. Of course, mother, he said with a smile, and she kissed his cheek once again. Sansa had shown no sign of coming to see her and hadn't even acknowledged her when she saw her, instead rushing off to the bastard once the melee was over. Cat had known where she was going and that the Rose of Highgarden and the Queen of Thorns went with her only made her feel worse, though that was nothing new whenever it came to the bastard, and he more than anyone was ruining her visit here. He did what? She said loudly when Lysa told her what had happened. He convinced the king to allow Prince Tommen to be his squire. Lysa said, and both she and Edmure looked at their sister as if she'd lost her mind. Ow, he's a bastard. How could the king, how could Jon have allowed this? Edmure asked. The prince has gotten it into his mind that Sir Jon is the greatest knight in the realm, that he's Duncan the Tall, come again, always with tales of how he wishes to squire for the bastard Pittertezes. Lysa said, looking to her. But the king would never allow him. Surely he wouldn't? She asked. The king cares only for what he cares for, Cat. He's a savage. The bastard wagered he'd win both the melee and the joust, with Prince Tommen as his squire. Lysa said. And the king allowed his son to squire over a wager. Aye, Lysa said. Then we'll have to ensure he doesn't win, won't we? Edmure said with a smirk. Yet she had watched on in horror as the bastard had shamed her brother once again. That he had then gone on to beat Lord Tarley and others on his way to winning the thing, only making her day worse. Unlike Edmure, she knew that out on the field was not where Jon Snow would be humbled. She tried that herself, only to see her plans foiled. No to humble someone with no breeding. You needed to show them up amongst their betters. So as she dressed for the feast that night, she began to try and see how she would do so, what way she could have him show his true colors in front of the king. While Lysa said that Prince Tommen was only to squire for him during the tourney, Kat feared she'd be wrong. If the prince was already enamored with the bastard, then him winning would only strengthen the prince's resolve. Her mind refused not to go to where she knew it would, the plan becoming far too clear in her mind, and she wondered how he always seemed to know things, how he was always able to foil her own plans. She'd make a move and he'd counter, and she had no idea how he managed it each time. He'd taken Robb and Sansa from her and ruined her plans for their matches. She'd, with Pitier's help, foiled his plans for Bran and in turn had gotten a match with a princess for her son. But just like with Robb and the Rose of Highgarden, the bastard was one step ahead once again. Countering Bran and Myrcella by getting close to the prince, and she began to see the paths opening up ahead of her. Bran would stop him taking Winterfell from Robb. His marriage to the crown would see that route blocked to the bastard. Would a prince who fell under a bastard's spell trump that in the same way the bastard's friendship with the Tyrell son had? Would he use Prince Tommen to rise beyond his station? Would he kill one prince to see another one crowned? Given the nature of bastards, she was sure he would, and so as she readied herself and made her way to the feast, she hoped to stop it before it was too late. "Kat, you look beautiful as always," Pitter said as Edmure led her into the great hall. "Thank you, Pitter. Will you be sitting with us?" she asked with a smile. "Would that I could, Kat. Unfortunately, I must sit with the Lord of the Vale, protocol," he said, and she was glad to see he looked as upset by it as she. "Perhaps we can speak later," she asked, and he smiled as he kissed her hand. "It would be my pleasure, Kat." They made their way to the seats, and she looked around at the other tables. They sat with the other houses of the Riverlands, as did each region with their own, other than the North who sat with the West. She had hoped Robb would sit with her, but he sat with the Manderleys and the Umbers, and that they all sat at the Lannister table made her ire rise. That the Lannisters hadn't arrived yet gave her hope that they may not, but she knew it was a vain one. Sansa sat laughing with Lady Margaery, and her daughter looked every inch the lady that she was, even the Rose of Highgarden not comparing in Kat's mind. Though the fact that she'd not even turned and acknowledged her presence was annoying, as was the fact that she sat in the hall with 3 of her children, separate but together. "The Lannisters," Edmure whispered, and she watched as they walked in. Lord Yaki was holding his wife's hand, and behind him, each of them was walking. When she saw the bastard, she felt a moment's happiness upon seeing the wound on his eye, and then it was gone. The thoughts of how easy it would have made her life if that wound was just a little deeper, more thoughts of regret than joy. She heard the whispers as people spoke of him, comparing him to far better men than he, just like the bold, or Lord Jaime. No, the sword of the morning, I tell you now. We've not seen the likes of him since Sir Arthur. She felt her anger rise and was glad she wasn't holding a wine glass in her hand, as she feared she'd crush it between her fingers. Plastering a smile on her face in case anyone was looking her way, she waited until they sat down, and then, only a moment later, they all had to rise when the king arrived. Sitting back down, her fingers began to drum against the table, and her mind raced 1,000,000 miles a second. Kat struggling through thoughts of trying to come up with a way to show the bastard for who he truly was. King's Landing, 297 AC. Sansa, she had to stifle her laugh when she saw Margaery look to Jon, her friend, had calmed since earlier that day, and she knew that Margaery felt some embarrassment at how she'd acted. Though Sansa felt her entirely justified and she had probably beaten her to the punch. While she'd been proud he'd won and happy that no one had been seriously injured, she'd been furious with Jon also. Now, though, she wished to enjoy herself, and so she sat at the table and found she was, even if it was at her friend's expense. Willis, too, seemed to be having fun as he noticed where she was looking. The table they'd been put at was almost on the opposite side of the room from Jon's, though there was nothing in between them but empty space. So from where they sat, they had an unobstructed view of where Jon sat, and from her vantage point, she could see both Margaery and Jon making doe eyes at each other. "You should speak to him," she whispered to Margaery. "I'm still angry with him," Margaery said, and Sansa resisted the urge to giggle. "No, you're not," she said. "I should be." Margaery replied. "Will you dance with him?" Sansa asked, and she saw Margaery's eyes light up. "I can't go to him, Sansa. He has to come to me." Margaery said, and Sansa nodded. "Could you not ask him, as the winner of the melee? Would not be improper for a lady to ask him to dance, would it?" Sansa said, but she could see that wasn't what Margaery was worried about. "Will you speak to him for me? Ask him to ask me?" Margaery said almost pleadingly. I will," she said with a smile which was returned. She looked around the room and waved back when Bran waved to her, looking over to see him happy to be sitting with her granduncle. When she turned to see the Riverlands table, she found her mother's eyes on her, and though she wanted nothing more than just turn away, she instead gave a small smile. Her mother smiled back at her before Sansa turned around, and then the king stood up and the room quietened. "Sir Jon, come forward, your king wishes to speak to you." The king said loudly, and Sansa and the rest of their table looked as Jon got up from his seat and walked to stand in front of the king. Your Grace, Jon said with a bow as he looked first to the king and then the queen. "A war wound, Sir Jon," the king said, pointing to her brother's eye. "A reminder not to remove a helm, Your Grace," Jon said to laughs. "You did a fine job out there, Sir Jon, just as you said you would, entertained me and all in this room. Is that not right?" the king said, and she heard the sounds of people agreeing and some cheers. "I owe it all to my squire, Your Grace. Prince Tommen told me who to watch out for. Is that not true, my prince?" Jon said, and she watched as Prince Tommen seemed to puff up and smile broadly at Jon. "It is Sir Jon I did as a squire is supposed to for his knight," the prince said, and she heard as people cheered for the prince, then Sansa smiling as Jon gave the credit away. "An excellent job, son. A good knight needs a good squire, and you've proved yourself true," the king said, and Sansa wasn't sure what it was. She heard in the king's voice, though she could see in his face, that he was full of pride for the boy. "We'll do just as well in the joust, won't we, Sir Jon?" Tommen said, and she heard the chuckles around the room, people laughing with a nod at the prince. "With your help we will, my prince," Jon said, and Robert laughed. "My lords, my ladies, I give you the winner of the melee, Sir Jon, and his squire, my son, Prince Tommen Baratheon," the king said, bidding the prince to rise. She, like everyone else, cheered loudly, and she laughed when she saw Jon look to Prince Tommen and shrug his shoulders, the prince laughing as he took his seat. Jon bowed to the king and queen and went back to take his own, and then the feast began. Even through the meal, Marguerite kept looking to Jon's table, and Sansa was glad when it was over, getting up from her seat and immediately walking over to speak to her brothers. Robb was being led to the floor by Winterfell, and she knew had she moved but a little later, then Jon would be dancing with joy. Instead, though, she made it to him first and practically dragged him out onto the dance floor. Joy just simply looking to Cregan, who took her hand, and soon even Wella was dancing. She smiled when she saw Loras go to ask Marguerite to dance, and even more so when she saw how Jon's eyes followed his friend all the way. "She wishes you to ask her to dance," she said as they began to move to the song. "I don't know if we should. She's angry with me. Besides, it was one thing to dance with her once. More than once, and people may speak," he said, and she pinched his shoulder. "What was that for?" Jon asked, looking to her. "For being an idiot. Don't think Marguerite is the only one annoyed with you over today, Jon." "Sansa," he said softly. "No, we'll deal with my annoyance at a later time. Now you'll ask her to dance, and no one here will think anything of the winner of the melee dancing with a lady. No one, Jon. Do you understand?" she said, staring at him, and as he began to laugh, she was about to say something to him, only for him to kiss her cheek. "It seems I'm surrounded by cleverer people than I," he said, and she looked at him when he kissed her cheek again. "Thanks, little sister." They danced a little more, and she found herself looking to her mother's table, the frown clear on her face, and soon Jon noticed where she was looking. "Have you spoken to her?" he asked. "No." "Sansa?" "I don't know what to say to her, Jon. I don't know what I feel about her," she said, looking to him. "She's your mother, Sansa? Trust me, if I could speak to my own," he said sadly. "Oh, Jon." She leaned in and hugged him, all thoughts of dancing gone for now. "Go speak to her, see if you can clear up what it is between you." "And if we can't," she asked worriedly. "And it won't be because you didn't try, Sansa, it'll be because of your mother, or because what she's done is something she feels no shame for." I'll talk to her, and Marguerite." I'll do the same, little sister," he said. And she smiled when the dance ended. Nervously, she made her way to her mother's table, her uncle sitting there looking at Jon as he moved to Marguerite, and she wondered if he'd say anything to her about him. He didn't. Instead, he just smiled at her and welcomed her to their table, and then moved to leave her sitting with her mother. "Mother, Sansa, it's so good to see you. Let me look at you, my sweet girl. Look at you. Look how you've grown." "It's good to see you, Mother," she said, though still a little stiffly. "You too, Sansa," her mother said, smiling at her. King's Landing, 2097 AC. Sugar Old Dane. The Dark Star. He'd arrived when the melee was already decided, the competition having taken place that day, and he had missed out. But it was the bastard of Winterfell that had won. It was a surprise. The boy surely too young to beat that particular field. It annoyed him a little that they'd been delayed, as he knew he could have taken that prize. But for the weather, them having to shelter an extra night, depriving him of the chance to test his mettle against the boy. Hearing people speak of him only made Gerald keener to see him for himself, and when they compared him to Arthur, he felt his jealousy rise. He was to be the next sword of the morning, to be the one people spoke of in hushed whispers, not some bastard who got lucky. Making his way to the feast that night, he looked forward to seeing his target and to planning her fall, but once there, it was the bastard he found himself focusing on. "Is he really that good?" he asked the Marcher Lords he sat with. "Better than they say," Lord Beric said. "You fought him, my lord?" he asked, and Beric smiled as he looked to Thoros, who sat beside him. "I fought him when he was but a babe. You heard of the tourney of Lannisport. That lad won the squires' duels there, and then the one in King's Landing and Highgarden. Sir Jon is unmatched. Sir Gerald. Barring Lord Jaime and the Bold, I doubt there's anyone even close," Lord Beric said, and Gerald felt his temper rise. "Or maybe he's just not faced a worthy opponent yet," he said, with an almost growl. "You think yourself such a man?" Thoros asked. "I know I'm such a man," he said with a smile. Watching as the bastard was giving plaudits by the king only increased his annoyance, but it was what happened. A little later, which really made him take notice, Sir Jon danced with a red-headed girl who he found out was his sister, and then Gerald watched as he walked to the table and asked the Rose of Highgarden to dance. Looking at the two of them out on the dance floor, he began to grin to himself. Two birds with one stone, he thought as he watched them move. He had seen that look in Arianne's face when they danced, lustful, eager. Either the bastard had already plucked the golden rose's maidenhead, or she wished he would. Either would suffice. For Gerald, killing her was a means to an end. He would take only the pleasure he got from achieving that end, or at least, that's what he thought. Now, though, knowing he was taking something away from Jon Snow that he cared about, well, that was just a bonus. "Does Sir Jon know the lady well?" he asked Lord Beric, who looked at him oddly. "Her brother squired for Lord Jaime with Sir Jon," Beric said a few moments later. "Ah, that explains them dancing," he said with a smile which seemed to put Beric at ease. He had planned to do some recognizance first, to find the perfect time to put the rose in the ground. He wondered now if perhaps he could find them together, see them both at the same time, put her down and face Jon Snow. Would he be that lucky? Should he take that risk, or should he let Jon Snow know after it was done? Let him find out it was he who took his love from him. That would be best, he felt. The boy would seek him out and challenge him, and his victory would be more public then. Today they'd celebrate the winner of the melee. Soon they'd be speaking his name. If Sir Jon was as good as they said, then the man who beat him would only rise by doing so. Build a legend on killing a legend. It would have been what he would have done had Arthur lived. To challenge him and see him fall and to take Dawn for his own. To beat the sword of the morning and then become the sword. Maybe this road would lead there too. "What's your name?" he asked the dark-skinned girl as he sat in the brothel that night. "Alaye," the girl said, smiling as she took the seat beside him. "Yours?" "You can call me the Dark Star," he said as he looked at her. "The Dark Star?" "I am of the night," he said with a grin as he took out some coins. King's Landing 2-97 AC. Willis. He disliked feasts and much preferred to eat alone with his family, though his father rarely allowed them to do so. More than the crowds, though, it was the dancing he really hated. To have to sit there while others took to the floor was hard for him to face. Willis didn't begrudge those who danced, and he enjoyed seeing the smiles on his sisters' and Sansa's faces when they did so. More, he wished he could join them or be the one to make them smile. Still, he was happy to see his sister in a far better mood than she had been, Jon speaking softly in her ear as they danced. His grandmother, he knew, had told Margaery to be wary of appearances, but he knew his sister and Jon needed this, and looking to his grandmother, it was clear that so did she. Looking around the room, he couldn't see Sansa anywhere, and he began to worry about her standing up. He nodded to his guards, and was ready to move from the table when his grandmother spoke. "Willis?" she asked. "Sansa, grandmother," he said, and she nodded at him as he walked away. Glancing up at the high table, he saw the prince was sitting there, and he found himself glad of that at least, and when he looked to the Riverlands table and saw that Lady Catelyn was speaking to her oldest son, he checked the room once more, trying to see if there was anyone else. Sansa would be what that was missing, and he found he couldn't see anyone he could think of. With another nod to his guards, they left the great hall and began to walk the corridors, and it was the sound of the voices that led him to where she was. Moving as fast as he could, he walked in their direction and found the doors to the balcony open, and listened as he moved closer. "Your mother is only looking out for your best interests, Lady Sansa," the voice said. "Is she Lord Baelish truly? How?" Sansa asked. "By warning you of your half-brother's true intent, my lady, warning you before it's too late," Littlefinger said. "My brother, Lord Baelish, my brother, not my half-brother, my brother," Sansa said angrily. "Of course, my lady. I was just repeating what your mother calls him." "Were you, my lord? Were you indeed?" "Lady Sansa, I fear we've gotten off on the wrong foot. I have no issue with Sir Jon. However, your mother believes, and the good book tells us so, does it not, that bastards are covetous by nature? Is that not so?" "Is it, my lord? I find I've no interest in my mother's view of the good book, and since you mean less to me than she does, why would I have any interest in yours?" Sansa said, and Willis found himself almost chuckling. "Lady Sansa, I meant no offense," Littlefinger said. "Yet I am offended all the same, Lord Baelish. Perhaps it's for the best, if you leave me to my own devices," Sansa said, and he could hear the sigh from the Master of Coin from here. "As you wish, my lady. Forgive me for the interruption," Littlefinger said, and walked away from her. He saw the angered look on the man's face as he walked from the balcony, and then the practiced smile appeared once he saw Willis. "Lord Willis," Littlefinger said as he looked at him, and then turned to look back at the balcony. "I'm afraid Lady Sansa is most upset." The smile now even more pronounced. "I'm sure she's feeling far better now, my lord," he said, and saw the little grimace before Littlefinger walked away. Willis walked to the balcony to find Sansa leaning against the wall with her eyes closed, her arms wrapped around herself. At first he thought she was crying, and he moved instinctively towards her before he looked closer and saw what it was she was doing. "Are we a wolf or a little bird today?" he asked, and she opened her eyes and smiled when she saw him standing there. "A wolf. Today I'm a wolf," Sansa said. "Do you want to speak about it?" he asked, and she just shook her head. "Very well," he said, moving closer towards her. He stood beside her with his guards standing outside the door. Unlike the other night with Joffrey tonight, it seemed to have taken more out of her. Then she'd been glad to see him because she feared what the prince may do, and she was alone. Now something had clearly happened which had upset her. During their talks, Sansa had told him many things about her mother and what she thought of Jon. She'd explained how it made her feel, and looking at her now, and given what Littlefinger had said, something along those lines had clearly happened again. As strong as she was, as clever as she was, Sansa was still a very young girl. He reached out and took her hand in his, and watched as she looked at it, and as he held it and stood silently beside her, Sansa began to cry. "Hush, hush," he said as he pulled her into his arms. "Why does she hate him so? Why can't she see what I see, what everyone sees? I don't know, Sansa, but she's not you, and you'll never be her," he said as she sobbed against his chest. I won't, I'll never be like her. Never," she said, and he stroked her hair and waited until she calmed down. Once she had, he took out his handkerchief and gave it to her so she could wipe her eyes. Sansa looking up to him, and he nodding to tell her that she'd not made a mess. As they walked back to the great hall, he felt her steps slow, and he stopped and looked down at her. "We don't have to go inside if you don't want. We could go back to the manse if that's your wish." "No, I want to sit with my brother. Will you sit with me?" she asked. "Of course," he said, and was glad to see her smile. He saw her mother glare at him when he passed her, and even more so when they walked to Jon's table. It only took a few minutes of them sitting there for Sansa's mood to improve, and it did so even more when Jon walked them back to their own Marguerite's too, when Jon sat down beside Sansa so they could all speak together. Willis admired her resilience as he looked at her. Her growth since she'd come to them was immense. The naive young girl had always had a sense of fierceness about her, but in the years since she'd been with them, she'd grown, and each time he looked at her, it amazed him. Now he found himself smiling as she did. Willis picturing the woman she would become, and hoping he'd still be in her life when she did so. King's Landing, 2097 AC. Robb. His mother was happy to see him and was most pleasant to Winifred, though they couldn't speak to her much at the feast itself. Robb had enjoyed it, and when not speaking to Winifred, had listened as people spoke of his brother's win. The king, not the only one who'd been impressed with it, though those closest to Jon had been incredibly annoyed about the risk he'd taken. Lord Wyman had been a mixture of both, and Robb wasn't sure what to make of how he reacted. Winifred more concerned with his safety than anything else, and that had made their dances that much more special. But it was Sansa he'd been most concerned with, and so he'd gone to the Tyros manse early that morning to speak to her. That and to have her join him when he spoke to their mother. "Lord Robb, what brings you here?" Lord Willis said as he was brought into the manse. "I came to speak to my sister, Lord Willis. Is she here?" "She is Lord Robb. You'll find her in the garden with Marguerite. Though it's a poor substitute for the rose garden, it does at least make the smell of this city fade, even if only for a time," Lord Willis said as he led him in the direction of the garden. "Jon says you breed the best horses in Westeros. My Lord Winter, she was one of yours, was she not?" "Aye, she was, though as fine a horseman as your brother is, I think he helps as much as the horse does," Willis said. "Ah, here we are." Sansa was sitting with Marguerite and some other girls, and when she saw him, she seemed a little confused that he'd come to visit. "Robb?" "Sansa, Lady Marguerite, ladies," he said, hoping he'd got his courtesies right. "Lord Robb," Marguerite said, while the other girls looked at him curiously. "Sansa, I was hoping we could speak," he said, and his sister got up and walked over to him, leading him to a different part of the garden while Willis took her place beside his sister. After she had led him a certain distance, his sister stopped to look at him, her expression a mixture of curiousness and intrigue, as she looked to him to explain his visit. "Robb!" "Sansa, last night, what happened?" he asked, and she looked to the ground. "With what?" she asked, her voice soft and far quieter than usual. "I don't know. You seemed upset, Sansa." "What happened? Sid, someone do something or say something to you?" he asked, and he was stunned to see her smile and then hug him, which he returned. "Sansa?" "It's nothing, Robb," she said, smiling at him, though he could tell she was lying. "Please, Sansa, tell me," he said, and she looked to the ground and then nodded. "I spoke to Mother to try and make things right between us." No sooner than a moment of sitting down with her, she spoke ill of Jon once again, said he used some trick to beat Uncle Edmure in the melee. The only trick he used out there was skill. "I only saw some of the fight, but Edmure went after him with 2 people and Jon beat them all," Rosier with a laugh. "I know, I told her that," pointed out how she's so quick to disparage Jon and challenge his honor, and yet had no issue with Uncle Edmure using 2 of his friends to go after him, but that wasn't the worst of it. "Robb," she said. "What else did she say, Sansa?" he asked, trying his best to keep his voice even. "She told me again how he wished to take Winterfell from you, and how he was now going to use Prince Tommen to do so," Sansa said, and he reached out and put his hand on her chin. When she looked down to the ground, raising her head so she was looking at him. "I'm sorry, Sansa. Perhaps when next you speak with Mother, I should go with you." "I don't want to speak to her, Robb. Each time I do it turns into the same thing. A crazy tale of how Jon is plotting against us, of how he's not to be trusted. I just want to scream at her and tell her the truth, and I know I cannot. I know she can't be trusted with it." "No, she can't. Will you come and see her with me today, both of us? Let her bring up Jon again if she wishes. We'll be there together. Maybe we should even play along. Robb, let her think we've begun to see things her way, and then get the full truth of what she thinks out in the open. Last night Winifred and I spoke with her, and she was most pleasant, Sansa. I realize now that it was after you spoke to her. She was putting on a mummery with me. What if we find out just exactly what she feels? Find out once and for all." "You would do that?" Sansa asked, surprised. "Jon has packed, Sansa. I think we have to know for sure whether Mother is," he said, and she hugged him once again. "Thank you, brother. Thank you for listening to me," she said softly in his ear. "Always, Sansa." They walked back to where Marguerite and the others were, and Sansa told Marguerite and Willis that she'd be joining him in going to visit their mother. Marguerite saying she'd go to visit the orphanage alone. "I didn't realize you had plans." "We could go later," he said, when she told him. "No, I think we should do this now. Besides, I told Marguerite that perhaps she should go to the manse and have Jon accompany her." Sansa said, with a smile as they walked from the manse. "King's Landing, 207 AC. Marguerite." She had meant to ask Jon to come with her the night before, but they'd been so swept up in making up for their argument and in trying to do so without attracting too much attention that she'd not gotten the chance to. This morning, when she woke, Marguerite felt that perhaps she should just go herself. As she was breaking her fast, though, Sansa asked if she could join her, and so she arranged it with her cousins and with Mira that they'd all go. As with so many things, though, Just because you make plans, it doesn't mean you get to carry them out. So just as with the previous night, these plans too ended up changing. Robin coming along and Sansa agreeing to go with him to see her mother. Marguerite felt a little put out, until Sansa sat down beside her and began to whisper excitedly in her ear. Why not have Jon go with you? Both of you had the idea and are the ones who see the supplies sent. Are you not? What if he has plans? I'm sure he'll cancel them for you, Sansa said, and Marguerite could see her little smirk. Sansa, she said with a giggle. We both know who you'd rather spend the day with anyway. Also, I don't think Alinor, Mega, or even Mira actually wanted to go to the orphanage. I had heard them speak of going to see the knights practice for the jousts, Sansa said, and Marguerite found herself nodding, knowing that Mega certainly wished to go and see the knights. So after Sansa and Robb had left, she told her cousins and went to speak to her grandmother. Willis walking with her as she sought her out, she found her reading a note which had her most distracted, her brother looking to her and their grandmother with some concern. Grandmother, she asked, and it took a moment for her to reply. What? Oh, sorry, sweetling, what is it? Is something wrong, grandmother? She asked. What? No, you were looking for me for something, her grandmother asked. Sansa and Robb have gone to see their mother, and I've allowed Alinor, Mega, and Mira go to watch the knights. I was going to go and see if Jon wished to join me when I visited the orphanages, she said, and half expected her grandmother to tell her why she could not. Very well, you should bring Jon back here with you when you return, Marguerite. I find I've need to speak to him, her grandmother said, and she found herself looking at her with intrigue. Are you sure there's nothing wrong, grandmother? No, sweetling, we'll talk later. Knowing her grandmother's mind at times to be thinking far ahead of her own, Marguerite just accepted it, for now more eager to see Jon and spend some time with him than to find out what it was that her grandmother was thinking on. With the girls gone, it also meant she didn't need such a large accompaniment of guards with her, and so it would be 3 rather than the 6 or 7 she'd normally bring. While the children at the orphanage had enjoyed her visits, Marguerite had always found them wary of how the guards would look at her and how close they would get. With Jon with her, he'd either be by her side or would allow Ghost to act as her guard. Marguerite remembering how the children had found the wolf far more tolerable than the guards the last time she'd gone with him. I think we shall walk, she said to her guards, who looked at her oddly. The Lannister manse is just up the street, and we can ride from there if need be, she said, and they nodded. She had only just reached the gate when she remembered Jon's present, and so she had them wait for her and rushed back inside to grab it. The small box still at the bottom of her chest where she'd left it. Unlike Flea Bottom or the main streets of the city, the gold cloaks patrolled here and kept the streets mainly clear of any beggars or children who were hungry. It didn't stop some getting as close as they could get to the wealthiest residents, and as Marjorie walked towards the Lannister manse, she noticed a few had snuck in. She walked over and reached into her purse, the coppers already in her hand, ready to be handed out, and as she turned, she was almost knocked to the ground, the man racing off with her purse in his hands. Stop, thief! 2 of her guards said as they chased after him. Are you hurt, milady? Sam asked, as he helped her up. No, Sam. I'm well, she said with a soft smile, which soon turned to horror. The sword that came through Sam's face, splattering her with blood. King's Landing 2097 AC. The Dark Star. One of the advantages with no one really knowing you was that it allowed you to go unnoticed. At the feast he had learned much of his target. That she and Jon Snow were either in a relationship of some sort or wished to be in one. He divined early enough. Some things he picked up in random conversations about the Rose of Highgarden, and some through more direct means. Doran had also given him some things to work on, that the lady cared for the poor and downtrodden, and that she regularly visited Flea Bottom being amongst them. After leaving the brothel, he had gone back to his rooms and began to plan things out, Flea Bottom being the likeliest place he felt. Given the reputation of the place, it could be made to look random, although he may stick out a little too much. So he decided to go and look at it that morning. As he strolled through it, it soon became clear that it was ill-suited to his purpose. The streets were too narrow and the escape route far too difficult. There was also the problem that even was he to change his appearance, he'd still raise too much attention to himself. No, it needed to be elsewhere, and so he walked to where the Manseys were and looked around. They're trying to find a much better place for an ambush. Which way is the Tyrell manse? He asked. A gold cloak who patrolled the streets. What business do you have with the Tyrells? The gold cloak asked. I need to speak to Lord Willis about horses, he said, and the man nodded and pointed the way. It was soon pretty clear to him that he'd not be sneaking into the manse itself, the place far too heavily guarded, and when he saw the people leave and how many guards followed each of them, he began to think this may be an impossible task. He'd not be able to rush the guards. Even a swordsman of his repute would struggle against 5 or 6 men. It was when he saw the children that he got his idea and hurriedly made his way back to Flea Bottom. The pickpocket was easy to find, and Geralt walked over to him, eager to recruit him to his cause. The man looking ready to bolt the closer he got. I'm not here to cause you trouble, friend. I bring you a proposition, a way to earn some real coin, he said, holding up his purse. Doing what? The man asked as he looked at the purse greedily, but at him far more warily. Doing what you do so well, I have use for a specialist such as yourself. What you take in the purse and what's in this one are yours to keep, he said with a smile. Both of them? The man asked, and Geralt nodded, throwing the purse to the man and seeing his eyes light up when he saw what was inside. Is the other as heavy as this one? Maybe heavier, but you have to do it as I say, and only when I give the nod. Aye, I can do that, the scruffy man said. And Geralt knew he'd need him to be bathed and changed, and so he brought him to a tavern to see that done. They arrived back at the manse early enough, though he worried that he may have already missed her, or that she may not leave this day. The idea of hanging around too much with Carl the pickpocket, not something he relished. The man seemed to think of them now as friends and was far too talkative. Me and you, Satyr, we could go into business for ourselves, make a pretty decent score in places like this, Carl said. Perhaps do this job well and I'll consider it, Geralt said. He had no intention to, but felt it best to keep Corl on his side for now. As you say, sir, the guards, will they chase? Carl asked. They will at first, but they'll not chase you for long, Geralt said with a smirk. Watching as a red-headed girl and boy left with their guards and 2 wolves, Geralt was glad to see that Marguerite wasn't with them. The idea of facing men was one thing. Looking at the size of the 2 beasts that walked beside the Stark siblings, facing them was not something he had any interest in. He sighed when he saw the large group which left next. 8 guards and a group of ladies was far too big to handle, though he was relieved to see that Marguerite was not among them. When she did leave, he couldn't believe his look. 3, that was all she brought with her. For 3, he didn't even need the pickpocket's help. Still, when he saw her speak to the children, he gave Carl the nod and almost broke out laughing when 2 of them chased after the man. Fucking amateurs, he thought as he made his move. The guard they'd left behind was almost begging to be killed. Who are you? Why? Marjorie asked as he pulled the sword from the man's face. I am of the Night, he said with a smile as he raised his sword. King's Landing 2097 AC. Jaxley's Targaryen. He moved quickly as he dodged the strike, spinning back away and moving in again. Jaime's blade was moving faster than he had seen before, and yet Jaime's was finding himself blocking it more and more. He could see the openings, and yet they were just beyond him, just out of reach, and so he didn't go for them, waiting instead for ones more suited and easier to take advantage of. He got the first hit in and then the second, and as he went for the third, he almost laughed at the trap he'd fallen into. Jaime smiling as he disarmed him and both of them breathing heavily once they were done. Moving over to the mugs, he nodded to Arthur, who took a seat beside them. I didn't see it, he said, and Jaime nodded. Sometimes you have to appear weak when you're strong, Jon. Lure your opponent in. Aye, about the melee, he began, and Jaime looked at him. What about it? Jaime asked, and he breathed deeply. Did it look as reckless as I think it did? Aye, it did, Jaime said. It wasn't? I mean, it was, but it wasn't. I had a plan. Jaime, all of it? I did plan it out, he said. Explain it to us, Jon, Jaime said. With the small Jon, I riled him up, made him angry, he began. What about Edmure? Arthur asked. The man's a fool. You don't plan to beat a fool, you just beat him, he said with a laugh, which he was happy to see them both join in with. Turley? Jaime asked. I saw an opportunity. Had I beat him then, that alone would bring me no gain. Sure he may, when he found out the truth, respect me a little more, but he'd still be shamed. He was beat by a bastard, he said, taking a swallow of the water. So you sang? Jaime said with a smile on his face. I used it, Jaime, used who I am, both to throw him off his game and to bring him into ours. That's why you took the helm off, Arthur asked. I had intended to put it back on, but he needed to see my face, he said, and Arthur nodded. Taxley is a loyalist, Jaime, knowing that a son of Rhaegar lives. Him being brought in helps us. Arthur said, and Jake saw Jaime nod reluctantly. Olenna? Jaime asked. I had Richard send her a note. I'll speak to her later today and tell her the full story, he said as Arthur looked to him. The giant, Jon? Arthur asked. I made an error there. Should have been beat. My blows weren't as effective as I hoped, he said. And Jaime nodded. Thoros? Jaime asked. What did it look like? He asked. Like the flames on his sword got out of control. Jaime said, shaking his head as if he was remembering it. The blood from this, Jaime said, reaching up to touch the wound. It dripped in and the flames grew. Melisandre told me there is power in King's blood, mine most of all. I've seen it with the flames, the glass candles, even with the eggs. Fire and blood is more than just words. Jaime, Arthur, the truth was there always and we forgot it, he said, and then reached up to his head again. Jon, Ghost, where's Ghost? He said, and began to run. Jaime and Arthur running after him. He almost crashed into the gate he was running so fast. His eyes closed as he searched for Ghost, the white wolf on the outer fringes of his mind. Pack, he felt the wolf say, and he ran even faster down the streets with Arthur, Jaime, Jorah, and Walder all now running behind him. He didn't know which direction he was going, whether it was the right one or why he turned here instead of there. All he knew was he was running faster than he had ever run before, and he was running out of time. Jay saw him then in front of him, the white wolf, nothing more than a blur, and he moved even faster, rounding the corner. He stopped in horror at the sight he saw. Who the man was, he had no idea. The body on the ground was unknown to him also. The woman the man had his sword ready to strike, though, was all too clear to him. The world seemed to slow. Ghost was too far away, and even with his speed, Jaysog could tell he'd not make it in time. The sword was drawn back, and readying its downward swing, and even from this distance he could tell the blow it would strike would be fatal. He closed his eyes and was soon looking into hers, Margaery staring at him terrified, her tears falling from her eyes, and his name on her lips. Whether it was because she saw him in the distance, saw a ghost, or just she expected it to be the last thing she would say, Jay wasn't sure, but as he held the sword high he didn't care. He'd stopped the movement, and the pain he now felt in his arm meant nothing compared to the sound of the sword, as it fell to the ground. Jablink then moved once again, racing over to her as the man rolled around on the ground, Ghost tearing his arm from its socket, and Jay shouting to Marjorie to look at him. By the time he reached her, the man's arm had been fully removed. Ghost closing his jaws around his neck, and Jay grabbed her in his arms as she cried against his chest. It's all right, I'm here, he said over and over again. She cried as he moved her away from the body of the man. Jaime and Arthur and the others now arriving. I've got you, Marjorie, look at me. I've got you, he said. And she looked at him, and he held her as the gold cloaks and the crowds began to arrive. King's Landing 2097 AC. Jaehaerys Targaryen. Fear wasn't something he was used to. Sure, he'd been scared at times, but never had he felt fear like he did when he saw that sword in the air. Knowing he'd not make it or that Ghost wouldn't make it had almost brought him to his knees, only for the fire to rise up inside him. The warging was instant, and before he knew it, he was looking down at Marjorie's face, her fear matching his own. Stopping the sword took everything he had, and even feeling the man's pain as Ghost bit into his arm wasn't enough to force him out of him. Only the sound of the sword falling did that. As he held her and told her that he was there, he turned her away so she didn't have to look at the man on the ground. For him, though there was another reason other than to protect her from the view, he wanted to see the man die. Ghost biting into his neck and the blood squirting from it made an even more gruesome sight next to the severed arm. When Jaime, Arthur, and the others arrived, Jay began to move with Marjorie, only for the gold cloaks to arrive at the same time. He watched as they looked from him to Ghost, from Marjorie to the bodies on the ground, and he prayed they'd not try to stop him from leaving. Unfortunately, he was not so lucky, and despite the fact that he was more concerned about his wife, he felt his anger rise as the gold cloaks stepped forward. You need to explain this, you both have to come with us, the man said, looking to him, and Jay felt Margaery lean even more into him. You do not want to interfere with me, Jade said, his mouth tight and his eyes full of anger, as he glared at the man. I need you to come with me, the gold cloak said, reaching out his hand to stop him. Get away from me now, Jade said as he moved past him, and whether it was the tone he used it or the fact that Ghost, whose mouth was covered in blood, was snarling at the man, Jade watched as he moved away. Behind him, he heard Jaime speak to the leader of the group of gold cloaks, and so he, Margaery, Arthur, and Walder all moved down the street. Ghost walking alongside him for added protection. All the way back to the manse, Margaery stayed silent, her head tucked in close to his chest as his arms never left her. Upon reaching the Tyrell manse, he saw the guards come rushing back, both of them quickly stopping when he looked at them. "Demon, find out what happened from them," he said, and Arthur nodded as he walked through the gate. "Sam," Marjorie said softly beside him. "What's that, my love?" he said as she looked to him. "He killed Sam," she said, and Jay just held her tightly before they moved to the door. "I'm so sorry, Marge," he said as he saw Willis come towards him, the cane hitting the ground rapidly as he moved far too fast for a man with a limp. "What happened, Marge, John? What happened?" Willis asked, worriedly. "I think you should find your grandmother and your mother. She's unharmed." "Willis, but there was an attack. Find them and we'll speak," he said, and Willis nodded. He led her to her room and called for the servants to fetch some water so he could clean the blood from Ghost's fur, knowing how the wolf must look to those around them. Once inside the room, he felt her throw both arms around him and she began to cry in earnest. Jay standing there and letting her sob against his chest. Lifting her into his arms, he carried her to her bed and lay her down, Margaery turning from him and facing the wall. He stroked her hair and felt her breathing begin to calm, and he whispered that she was safe and that he'd never allow anyone to harm her. Promising her, he then closed his eyes and prayed to the old god to help him hold this promise true. Olenna and Willis were the first to arrive, and Jade prepared himself for the questions. "What happened? Is my granddaughter hurt?" Olenna said her concern clear, and Jay felt Margaery shiver against his hand. "She's unharmed, Lady Olenna, but perhaps she needs something to help her rest," he asked and hoped she could read his eyes, something that she must have been able to do as she sent for some dream wine a moment later. Jaxley could see she wished to sit down and be with Margaery, but when he went to move away, he felt his wife grab his hand, and so he looked once again to Olenna, who nodded. Instead, he moved up the bed some, his hand still on his wife's back, and this allowed for Olenna to sit down and be close to her also. When the servant came back with the dream wine, Jack watched as well as mixed it with some berry juice and then handed him the glass. "Marge, you should drink," he said, and she turned her head from the wall and looked up to him, her eyes red from where she'd been crying. "Please, for me?" She took the glass from him and drank it down, and he leaned forward and kissed her softly on the cheek, watching as she turned back to face the wall once more. Thankfully, by the time Adderley and Mace arrived, she was asleep, and Mace's loud proclamations were shut down by Olenna before they could wake her. "What happened to my daughter? I'll see this whole city ransacked to find those responsible," Mace said loudly. "Oh, please shut up, Mace. Let her sleep. She needs it," Olenna said, and looked to him. "I don't wish to risk not being here when she awakens my lady. Perhaps we could speak away from the bed." Jay said, and Olenna had the servants prepare some chairs for them to sit on. Jay looked at Ghost in the water and saw Ollery look to the wolf too, her face crinkling up when she saw the blood, and he wished he'd had time to clean it. Moving his hand from Marjorie's back, he stood up and walked with Olenna to the chair, watching as she bid them all sit. "What happened, John?" Olenna asked as soon as they sat down. "I was in the gardens of the manse of my lady when I felt something wrong. It was here Lord Yan Sarademon and Servolder and Jorah's left, and when we found Margaery, one of her guards had been attacked, and a man seemed ready to attack her." Jade said and looked to Olenna, trying to say he'd tell her more when they were alone. "Who is this man? Where is he? I'll have his damn head for this." Mate said loudly, Hallery taking her husband's hand in her own. "The man is dead, my lord. It seems we arrived just in time, and Lady Margaery was unharmed physically, though she did see one of her guards killed and the man ready to attack her." "One of her guards, where were the others?" Olenna asked. "I do not know, my lady. As we arrived back here, 2 guards came running. I've asked Sir Daemon to speak to them. The one who died was called Sam, I believe." "Franklin's boy," Ollery said sadly. "Where were the damn gold cloaks?" Mate said angrily. "They arrived later, my lord. They wished to speak to me and to Lady Margaery, but I put them off for now. Thank you, Sir John, for everything." Ollery said, and Mace nodded. This has rattled Lady Margaery badly, my lady. I are on your way back here. I think it's for the best if I'm here when she awakens, just so she doesn't feel any worse than she already does." I don't think, Mace began. I think that's an excellent idea. Sir John, far better she awakens to the face of the man who brought her here than think she's been abandoned. Ullery said with a smile, My love, it's not proper, Mace said. I would of course not be alone with Lady Margaery, my lord, at any time, he said, and saw Mace look to his mother and then his wife before finally nodding to him. As the Towers got up to walk to Margaery, Jane leaned in to whisper to Olenna, telling her he was going to speak to Arthur and that he'd explain further a little later on about what he found out and what he had left out. Walking to the door, he looked to Ghost, who sat down, and then he walked out to speak to Arthur, needing to find out who this man was and who sent him.